Welcome attendees. My name is Graham Swalling and I will be moderating today's webinar. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webcast titled, Building a Cybersecurity Architecture to Combat Today's Risks. Before we start, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping items. If you have questions during the presentation, please ask them through the questions feature in your BrightTalk control panel. If we don't get a chance to answer your questions during the webinar or in the group chat feature, we will contact you to follow up after the presentation. As well, if you are more comfortable asking a question in a language besides English, please do, and we'll translate it for our presenters. Today's session will be recorded and available on demand via our website later this week. In addition, BrightTalk will be sending out an email following the webinar with a link to the recording. So, with housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to introduce today's speaker and start the webinar. From LogRhythm, we have Erik Bartholomy, our security architecture, and he's joined by Erik Bartholomy, CISO of Sonepar. Erik Bartholomy brings more than 20 years of experience working in corporate IT security and consulting. At LogRhythm, he develops and maintains the company's security architecture, governance, models, and risk strategies, and protects the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information assets. Joining Erik is Erik Bartholomy, CISO of Sonepar, Canada. Erik has 30+ years experience in security and holds multiple prestigious security certifications. He has worked as a security advisor for numerous large national and international corporations at the C-level. Outside of work, Erik can be found teaching cybersecurity courses at École Polytechnique in Montreal. Presenters, I'm pleased to have you with me today. Erik B., would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you. Hello, my name is Erik Bartholomy, and I'm a security architect at LogRhythm, and I report into the Chief Information Security Officer. I solution and implement LogRhythm's security architecture. If you're not familiar with LogRhythm, we build SIM technology, and we help companies enhance their security operations by unifying log management, event management, and security information. There's some emerging architectural patterns that look very promising, such as zero trust, which I'll discuss in today's presentation. I'll explain how these architectures solve today's new cyber threats. But let's start with the definition. Cybersecurity architecture, aligning technology, people, and processes to the enterprise's security objectives. It's not just about technology. From a governance standpoint, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate level of IT security to meet your business objectives. You're not going to go out and buy and implement every security control you can think of. It needs to be more strategic. Let's talk about modern cybersecurity and the threat landscape. The 5 threats listed here are the most pervasive threats that pose the greatest risk to your business. Number 1, socially engineered malware and ransom-based attacks, password phishing attacks, unpatched software, social media threats, and advanced persistent threats. These threats are crippling company security posture. Erik Bartholomy, are there any other threats that come to mind for you?
Well, I guess one of the primary threats is the fact that most enterprises simply don't know. They think their maturity is higher than they actually are, and that causes a lot of problems because the cyber criminals that we're facing are obviously way more prepared to attack certain things, and they only have to find one way in, whereas an enterprise needs to protect itself against every possible combination of problems.
Thank you. That's true. For decades, well, millennia, security controls have been built around protecting a single massive corporate perimeter. And then we started punching holes into the perimeter in order to transfer data remotely, and IT security was forever changed. Let's spend a few minutes talking about this new landscape. Corporate information is migrating to the cloud. So to help manage cost and risk, many companies have adopted a cloud-first strategy, so they don't have to manage as many of the security requirements. You can offload many of your infrastructure and physical controls to another party. Now, not only could you lose data from your on-prem systems, but now you can lose data from the cloud as well. According to Okta, Most businesses use between 11 and 16 off-the-shelf cloud apps, and they've seen as many as 40. In some cases, companies are completely virtual. They don't have a building. The whole team works remote using a multitude of mobile devices. Interesting fact, IBM has over 400,000 employees, and approximately 50% of them are mobile or work from a non-traditional office. What you're looking at right now on this slide is the architecture of the modern enterprise. Let's look at a brief history of security architecture and our current state. 1,000 years ago, during medieval times, they too had information they needed to protect, such as battle plans, armory assets, holy books, scrolls, and documents, even account ledgers. The way crown jewels and information were protected was by a hardened physical perimeter layer. Protecting the data in the modern age, in the last 50 years during the information age, we've built upon this model. However, we've created a number of additional layers beyond the physical perimeter. And we'll talk about these additional layers like the perimeter, network layer, host, application, and data layers, and the current defenses and countermeasures for each one. I'm going to go through these layers of defense rather quickly, try to get a sense of the number of security controls for each layer. We'll start with the physical layer. Look at the controls like perimeter chain link fence, padlock, security guards, front desk in the lobby. Then this was expanded to include the data center where we keep the crown jewels information. Notice the additional physical controls like monitoring and HVAC. And then came the perimeter layer. Around 1988, when the internet was in its infancy and traffic evolved, so did our firewall and VPN technology and all of its protections. And this is where we started punching holes into our hardened perimeter. Then the network layer, which has the largest number of security controls, and it's within this layer where we have our SIM product, which is used for log management. We had the application layer, which was deployed on the host and its controls. And then we had the data layer and all of its controls. And there's one more layer. But folks, it's probably the most important layer of control for both today's architecture and future architectures. And Erik Bartholomy mentioned this about governance. And this includes zero trust. Due to all of the various controls which need to be managed and regulated, we need to glue it all together. We need to make sure that all the people, processes, and technology are working effectively together. As an example, now that you have all of these fancy security controls, you need to make sure that they're patched on a regular basis or even working properly, or ensuring that you have people that are properly trained. Also, notice that each layer was built from the outside inward, starting from the physical layer and moving inward to the application and data layer. And quite often, those layers act independently from one another, and many of those bolt-on components don't talk to each other. That creates complexity. Once the threat actor gets a foothold into the environment with elevated privileges, say from phishing attack or an unpatched server, they can move up and down the layers, and laterally wreaking havoc on your organization. And this is what people refer to as that gooey inside, that hard, crunchy perimeter on the outside and the soft, chewy on the inside. Now, look at all of the controls we just reviewed, roughly 50, and these aren't all of them. There are some frameworks like NIST or CSA where there are hundreds of controls, and that's why we struggle with security. The layers of defense are just layers of security controls. With each device or control, there are multiple brands with different features, capabilities, integration issues. Also, they require patching, licensing, configuration, and tuning, and most importantly, skilled resources. Sadly, it doesn't matter if you work for a Fortune 500 company or a company of 500 people, you'll most likely have to juggle the same number of components. There's got to be an easier way. And notice the SIM component in the middle of the diagram with that little red box. The SIM component pulls information from your various security controls and your IT environment and correlates the data to detect anomalies and potential threats. Within LogRhythm, we use our own SIM technology to detect threats. Sonepar uses LogRhythm SIM for log management, event management, and security information as well. Let me turn the presentation over to Erik from Sonepar to explain how Sonepar uses LogRhythm within their security program.
All right, good day to everyone. So Sonepar started using LogRhythm not that long ago, but we did have a certain progress to go through before our maturity was ready, basically, to adopt these types of technology. So initially, if you go back many years ago, we did an initial intrusion test, and my firm, because I'm actually the CEO of a consulting firm that doesn't sell products but sells basically brain, and we basically come in, analyze the company, and do certain tests, and then coach at the senior executive level, so they start taking good decisions. And most companies, Sonepar was not out of that loop, but most companies are behind in technology, so there's a certain debt that's been accumulated over time, and the same thing happens in security. And one of the metrics that's often heard from Gartner and some of these firms is that you're supposed to spend 5% of your IT budget, 5 or 6% of your IT budget on security. But that causes a problem when you're using these types of metrics, because what happens if your IT budget is severely underfunded and understaffed, you're missing resources or missing technology, then that budget is obviously smaller. So the 5% you're using as a calculation is already handicapped. And merge into that another concept that if you haven't really been doing security in a very mature way for the last 10 years, maybe you're only doing 1% of the 5%. So that means you're missing that 4%. And that's 4% over 10 years, that's 40%. So you've got to be very careful with these metrics. So when we first started working with Sonepar, one of the first things we did is we did an intrusion test in order to test out the environment and sort of kick the tires and see where the weaknesses are. And for us, the philosophy of doing an intrusion test means that it's off limits. Nothing is off limits, sorry. So the client or management can't really tell us what to test. And that's just our philosophy. And a lot of enterprises, most enterprises, don't do intrusion tests that way. That actually causes a lot of problems. Because if you're going to scope an intrusion test, then you've got to realize that it's not really a true intrusion test. You're not testing everything, and you're not letting a security analyst actually decide where the low-hanging fruit is or where the most probable way of attacking an enterprise would be. So we started by doing one of these no-holds-barred types of tests, and we tested remote attacks and one on-site attack just to have something documented from the on-site scenario, which is not usually something you would normally do. It depends really on your industry. So is somebody really going to walk into your office and violate your physical perimeter? That doesn't apply to everybody. So we went and did all three of these tests. And as we do the tests and we get in, because obviously we're using a team of 5 or 6 people that are actually doing these tests simultaneously. So the probability of not getting in is almost 0. So we're always going to get in, but it's really about how much effort does it take. And until somebody does something wrong that allows us to get in. So if you think of the traditional phishing attack, it may take a couple of days to prepare a phishing attack. But at one point, if you launch a phishing attack and within minutes somebody has clicked on something malicious and you've taken over a workstation, then that's a very short time frame. And then from that point forward, how long can you actually stay in control of that workstation before somebody detects something is the second metric that we're going to work with. So obviously when we did this first test, we got in within the 48 hours, which is a reasonable time frame, and then we stayed there for 45 days. And as we stay there, doing different things, doing some lateral movement and collecting more data, near the end, we try to get more loud. We want to get more verbal, if you will. We want to start, without breaking things, we want to start becoming more obvious in order to see when something is going to be detected and something is going to happen. And the reality is, at that time, Sonepar, like most companies, by the way, it's very important to mention that because it's, most companies don't think that they'd be this blind, but most companies are. And so no real bells went off, even though some workstations may have had some anomalies and some things on some certain servers may have happened. Since there was no correlation of this data, it all looked like just random IT stuff that happens because, things break in IT all the time. So having one weird thing happen is only one weird thing. And if you don't have the visibility of seeing that you have a lot of these awkward things happening, then maybe nobody's going to pick up on it. So obviously we didn't get detected, and we walked into a presentation afterwards, presented to the CEO. Here are the findings. And obviously the first question that comes to the CEO's mind is how come we didn't detect this stuff? What's missing? And so there was a lot of different things that needed to be addressed, and that's what got me into the company, in a sense, to be their CSO. So initially, we didn't have anybody selected to take on that charge or that load, that workload, and so I took that on as an outside component. So I started acting as their CSO. And so eventually we did a second round of testing, intrusion testing. Once again, nothing was off limits, all remote this time. We didn't do any internal physical stuff. And the conclusion on the second round of tests, after obviously making some changes, putting in some technology, was that it was more difficult to get in. It took 5 days, but we still stayed there for 60 days, still no central visibility, because at that point, we did not have a central logging or SIM solution. And so presented to the CEO once again, that's the follow-up. So he's obviously very pleased that the 48 hours is now to 5 days, but he's obviously not pleased that there's still no visibility. There's nothing concrete to trigger something that says something is wrong. So the CEO's happiness is really a proportion or a graph that can be compared to risk mitigation and risk acceptance. He wants a certain level of mitigation, and it's okay for him or the board to decide that they're going to accept a certain level of risk. But it has to be a reasonable amount of risk, and they have to understand it, which is often the problem. And in Canada, it's very common to have a CSO or CISO that reports strictly to the IT director or the VP of IT, and does not have the actual right to talk to anybody else. And those are terrible positions. I would not want that position. At Sonepar, it's a basically open book, so they're very honest, very transparent, and the CEO is very aware of everything that's going on. So we need to bring to him some concrete things that he can take a decision on, and he'll decide if they will have the budget to mitigate or if they want to accept that risk. So we provided basically a 3-year plan that included certain basic things, repeated password quality audits, because users will always have weak passwords if you're not checking them. And these may seem very basic, but I can tell you from experience, because I take care of I have over 45 clients that we provide CSO services for, and they're all the same. So when you do an audit for a password, there's always something wrong. There's always somebody who has autumn 2018 as a password, which is a terrible password. So we did some intensive security awareness training at different levels and integrated new ways of doing awareness training. That's an ongoing challenge, because getting the employees to actually buy into awareness training is always a challenge. And then we put in the centralized event correlation and analysis and reporting, which is the LogRhythm solution, which gave us that visibility. The way we did that is we had a roadmap, obviously, and we needed to have somebody technical take charge of these things, somebody who understands the business, somebody who's very tech savvy, and somebody who understands the technology that's in place. So at Sonepar, we got lucky. Not every enterprise is going to have this luxury, but we were lucky. They have a pretty big IT team, and out of that team, there was one particular individual that had all the qualities necessary. All that person needed was to be convinced to move, let's say, away out of IT, in a sense, and move into operational security. And this is one of the rare instances where we sort of win the lottery, because we end up having somebody there. All the ingredients are there. The person is absolutely marvelous. We pull them out, give him the role of OPSEC, and next thing you know, you've got a team leader that knows exactly what he's doing. And this person obviously spearheaded the deployment of the SIM solution. So we went and did product reviews, and the way we do product reviews, since we do not sell technology, I don't mean Sonepar, but in my own enterprise, we basically interview people. So we have a lot of contacts, so we reach out to large enterprises that resemble the landscape of Sonepar and basically ask them, what do you guys do? And obviously some don't do anything, but some of them do, and they have some field experience. They have an opinion on a given product. So we collected a lot of data, a lot of opinions from about 6 or 7 different large organizations, asked a lot of questions, and from there it became pretty clear that for us, the way we were weighing it out, LogRhythm was actually the winning solution, but we also still have to do a POC. So we have to ask concrete questions too. So we have to know what the learning curve is and what's the cost to acquire and deploy, but also what's the cost to operate it or to add to it as we move forward. And these are the things that the LogRhythm solution really scored high on. So going forward, we identified LogRhythm as the product candidate that we don't want it to POC. So what we did for the POC is we actually rolled it out and timed it so that we would be doing an intrusion test at the same time. And this was sort of key to us, because while we're doing the intrusion test, we know what we're doing, and so we're expecting to be detected. And if we're not detected, then we know that there's something to be tweaked, something to be optimized, and so we wanted to keep that data also. So after the intrusion test was completed, when we moved out of the POC, after we basically approved the technology and said, this is what we want to buy, one of the requirements was to move the POC environment into production and actually keep that data, which which LogRhythm was able to do for us. So we ended up having basically our purchase product deployed. We maintained the data during the proof of concept, which included our intrusion testing test results, if you will, or test observations. And then you could continue tweaking those, knowing what we did during the intrusion test, to try to make sure that in the future these types of activities, hostile activities, are detected earlier in the game. So essentially, that was our process for selecting, and obviously it was a lot longer than just the 30 seconds that I'm giving it, but that was essentially it. So we wanted to evaluate the product. We had some test scenarios, some milestones to respect and to gather information for, and it came out. Like I said, I don't recommend officially. I don't recommend solutions until we've done a POC. So in this case, since I don't sell products, but I can honestly say that this was the best product that we evaluated, and this is the one that we obviously selected and deployed.
Yeah, thanks, Erik. That's great. And just to comment on the maturity of security controls, as we outlined in that previous slide with all the controls, I mean, trying to struggle with all of those controls and getting the maturity, finding that right person, being able to configure and patch is very important. And you even mentioned the need for security awareness. Security awareness is probably one of the top security controls that we have. It's a critical security control, making sure that your people don't do dumb things. They don't click on the wrong things and get phished. So yeah, there's an awful lot that goes into security, but you can start, and you can start your journey, and you don't have to go out and deploy 1,000 different controls or 100 different controls. You can start with some basic ones like security awareness and logging.
Well, I think the key thing is you always have the same problems, right? The passwords are weak. People fall victim to phishing, and when something goes terribly wrong, you have nothing to look at, and you have no data that's being correlated. So those are probably three of the most common things that I see. Obviously, from a detection point of view or from a reaction point of view, it's the biggest problem. You go in somewhere, something's gone terribly wrong, and you start looking. There's nothing to look at, right? There's no centralized logging. The logs have been deleted. They've been rolled over. There's no correlation. So people have a tendency to think that IT stuff is magic, and you can just ask for somebody to do a forensic analysis, and they'll be able to you pull anything up. But that's not true. If the logs aren't there, if they were never generated, you just don't have that visibility.
You can't find those
anomalies. And if it's not centralized, you can't. Yeah, you can't match the two together.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So what we can talk about, so how do we simplify this? So we talked about, many controls, hundreds of controls that we have to try to manage. There's got to be a simpler way, especially when you start looking at, trying to protect data. There's just an awful lot. And with all those controls, how do you keep on top of it? So there's some cybersecurity architectures that come out that have helped simplify this. And it's relatively new. Google has just implemented their version of it called Beyond Corp. You might want to look that up. And it's very compelling. And it's so compelling that LogRhythm decided to look into it, and we're aligning our security policy and program to Zero Trust. So what I'd like to do is just spend the remaining part of this presentation to go through that. And Erik, feel free to chime in wherever you want. So yeah, let's talk about some of these emerging cybersecurity architectures. We're going to spend some time talking about the Zero Trust model. It was developed by Forrester in 2009 by John Kindervach. So this is already about 10 years old. So it's not new. But the core concept is that all devices, networks, and users are deemed untrusted. So no longer trusted or untrusted networks, users, or interfaces. And there's some notable quotes. You must design the network of the future from the inside out, starting from data and moving out, which is just the opposite of the traditional layered approach that I showed you before, where you started off with that hardened physical perimeter and then move into data. And then Zero Trust network architecture components are made up of microcores and perimeters. So we'll go into that in a little more depth. So here are 5 steps to create a Zero Trust network. And what you'll notice, and I think Erik and I are both saying the same thing, it's not about technology alone, but a lot of it is governance. It's making sure that you're doing all the right things on a regular basis. So number 1, identify your toxic data sources. So, I mean, today where we've got just oodles of data, petabytes of data, you can't look at all of it. You can't begin to use NIST to classify it with public, and so instead of looking at your public and your internal and confidential and restricted, just look at your toxic flows and your toxic data. And you would imagine it's just a subset of all of your data. So you're not looking at videos and old lunch menus. 2, map the transaction flows regarding toxic data. So in other words, if you think about it from a value chain standpoint, it would just be a subset of applications. And then 3, architect zero trust networks based upon those toxic data sources. So determine the data flows in and out of your organization. And that's kind of an architectural exercise. So it doesn't have anything to do with technology. And then write your rules on segmentation gateway based on expected behavior of the data. And then 5, monitor the network and log the traffic. You can start using your SIM in a more proactive way. Instead of being reactive and using it for threat hunting, you can use it for you can use it more proactively, kind of a risk-based way. There are a couple companies out there that are getting into zero trust. Google, the most notable, with their Beyond Corp. It's something you might want to look into. Moving the plane of trust. Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh, I see what happened here. Let me move forward a little bit. Nope, there we go. Okay, there's 5 domains. Each domain should be considered an independent segment with its own perimeter. Access should be considered for each segment. So to get back to what Erik was saying, you got to make it difficult. So the idea behind zero trust is that you're going to look at each of these segments: users, devices, network traffic, applications, and data, and you're going to check for access for each one. And then in aggregate, you're going to decide whether or not the access decision is appropriate. And we'll talk about each one. Let's talk about one form of segmentation, and we'll look at an on-prem use case. Now, remember, this was from 10 years ago, so this was almost before cloud was as pervasive as it is today. So this is kind of an on-prem network, but you can now apply this to cloud, obviously. So in this case, we could segment a finance application that has a high business criticality, and through the use of segmentation rules, only allow certain roles or individuals access to that segment. And you configure that segmentation. It would be like a network segment off of a segmentation gateway like a Palo Alto. Now, if you had a 3-tiered architecture, like what we're showing here, you could create segmentation rules that could be applied to only allow business-critical applications to access the data. And that would prevent users from having direct access to the database server. So notice where separate perimeters are being created around your assets. The microcore design, also known as microsegmentation, drastically reduces these common threats due to the fact that every component has its own security zone, its own perimeter. It's not all plopped into one trusted security zone, and it prevents lateral movement because access is controlled at every step. And so you can see that would reduce the socially engineered malware, password phishing attacks, and advanced persistent threats. So LogRhythm is following the same approach. So let me describe our zero trust journey. Okay, let's focus on the data plane at the bottom. And you'll notice we're addressing each of those zero trust segments. So going left to right, we've got people, device, network, application, and data at the far right. And we'll go through each one. So for number 1, people. Are they employees? What's their role? We're currently implementing an Okta ADP integration that forces ADP to be our single source of truth. Our HRMS system will provision access to users with a specific role and permissions. It even provides a dashboard of applications that the user is entitled to. 2, device. We're rolling out MDM through Okta to determine if the device is a corporate-owned asset and can be trusted, and we're using X.509 certificates. And then 3, network. We're using Okta's built-in policy engine, and we're also using our network monitor called Netmon, and where we can tell where the user and traffic is coming from, like geolocation, or even the time of day. And we can even determine if the location of the cell phone is in proximity to the user's access. And then for authentication, number 4, we use Okta to initiate credential challenge. And it's based on Okta's policy engine to assess the access and enforce the decision. This includes two-factor authentication where users can use their own cell phones. And then 9, application and data. We're implementing microsegmentation on our Palo Altos around finance and accounting information. And we're actively planning on implementing privileged access management, PAM, and we hope to have that completed by early 2019. It's important to note, too, that we've conducted a data classification exercise, so we know where we have sensitive and toxic data and the application where the data resides. For instance, is access to the data and data classification appropriate to the user and their role? And then lastly, the control plane. So down below you'll see the data plane, with the user and the device, but the control plane is where all the decisions are taking place. So we take all the attributes from the data plane. We take attributes from the people, were they an employee, a device, was it trusted, network, do we know if it was a home network or was it from around the world, was it a weird time, and what application and what data are they trying to get to. And we also include user behavior, and then we can determine what level of access is necessary to authorize a given user and their role based on policies. This is sometimes referred to as adaptive access or risk-based access. And we're using our SIM and Netmon to detect anomalous behavior based on our policy, AIE rules, and then we can send API calls to Okta to enforce access control. For instance, step-up authentication, or we can challenge a user with security questions if we detect anomalous behavior. And in the future, we're collaborating with Okta to integrate our SIM where we can have Okta access our own policy engine, where we can assess access based on data classification, role, and user behavior. And that's our Zero Trust journey, where we use the LogRhythm SIM in a more proactive way.
I actually like that. Can I add a comment about this Zero Trust concept?
Sure.
So, like many of these themes, they do become marketing things at one point. And from what I see from the way the LogRhythm is doing it, you're actually doing it the way the concept is meant to be done. However, there are plenty of companies that use that actual acronym, if you will, or that title to mean all sorts of things. And I was called into a crisis management event at another client a few months back. And they had a complete breach, basically, and their board of directors is actually inbred. So there's actually somebody on the board of directors that represents the IT company that manages their IT. So long story short, they then ended up recommending a zero trust model from a certain firewall supplier, and it was sold to the board of directors as being the solution to protect them, even though they had no idea where their inventory was or where any of their sensitive data was. So the recommendation from the crisis management team was, listen, if you're going to go get millions of dollars, that's fine, but you have to control your inventory. You have to have some clue of where your data is before you do that. Now, since it was one of these crisis events, the board of directors needed to feel they're doing something. They went and authorized a multi-million-dollar project of putting firewalls in front of everything. So imagine that now. They're putting a security guard in front of everything, but they have no idea what everything is. So they spent $2 million, basically tell all these security guards to let anything through until they get a grasp on their inventory. And a year later, they don't have a grasp on their inventory. So we do have to be careful of marketing terms, but in the way you're describing it, the way you're using it in the LogRhythm solution, that actually works. That actually all makes sense. So.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting because we've been talking about governance, right? So what Erik was saying is that you just don't go up and buy all this stuff. So, I think in Zero Trust, it includes PAM and CASB and multi-factor authentication and identity and access management. That's all good, well and good. And you can install this technology, but if you don't know where you have toxic data and you don't know what devices you have, your whole philosophy is flawed. So it really is about governance. So a lot of people kind of roll their eyes when they hear about governance. Patching. That was another thing too. And when you talk about security awareness, patching is huge too. If you think about most of the exploits that we've seen, it's because of an unpatched server. So do you have a standard within your corporation where you're able to then, you can patch servers on a timely basis? If it's a web-facing server, if it's critical type of vulnerability, can you get that patched in a day or so, or do you wait, a year when it's way too late?
Right, and that's where that traditional 5% rule that some Gartner and Forrester and all them tend to use doesn't work, because where do you put the patching, for example? Is that part of the 5% security budget? Because patching is operations, and patching is not security. So it's like owning a suite, or not a suite, but a whole series of trucks that go out on the road, and the tires get worn, and you have to change the tires, and are changing tires security? No, they're not. So that's why you have to be very cautious with some of these things. And patching is very important, and it's not really a security thing. So it becomes a security thing when you don't do it. But it's not a security thing to begin with, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And interesting, the word cybersecurity. I like to talk about that because we use cybersecurity all the time. Cybersecurity, cyber technology. The word cyber actually comes from the word Kubernetes, which is to govern or to steer. So it's funny, when people think about cybersecurity, they think that there's some magic bullet that they can buy and leverage, but that's not the reality. It's just quite the opposite. There's governance. That's it's around people and your technology and your assets. There's a lot that goes into that. Well, great.
All right, great presentation. Many thanks, Erik, and nice job overcoming those moving slides. Apologies to our audience about that. So let's open it up to some questions, and attendees, please feel free to submit any that you have. We do have a couple in right now. One of the ones that people are asking about is just back to this zero-day model. Is it something that you see typically brought from the ground up, from practitioners up, or are you seeing it brought forward by C-level and executives?
I can take a stab at this. I think typically it comes from the field, and I think it needs to get communicated. But I think this gets back to governance as well, is that there needs to be open channels. There needs to be a culture of security. So as we gather threat intel, we can take this up to the board and do threat modeling, that sort of thing, to understand what risk that vulnerability potentially has, like a zero-day has on the business, so that we can be prepared for it. It's one of those things you don't want to wait until the last minute when you have a zero-day and then you're trying to fix it. You need to understand what the likelihood and impact is to your business. And then that's a good starting point. When you start looking at your from a governance standpoint, you're looking at your toxic data. Look, if you don't have any toxic data and there's nothing that can be compromised, you're going to have a small security budget. But if you've got HIPAA data, PCI, DSS, and FedRAMP and everything else, you better start preparing, because even if the likelihood is low, the impact is going to be huge.
All right, thank you. We've got a question for Erik Parent, which was, there's some interest around the proof of concept and the pen testing that you did. What type of long-term value have you seen from that initial value? How did it get your team using the product a little quicker?
Well, I guess the thing that really helps cut corners is understanding how something behaves. And it's not just the SIEM itself, it's how it behaves in your infrastructure. So when you're doing the testing, at the same time, you sort of know what you're doing. And so that helps you see what you see, or no, not see what you see, it sounds funny, but what you see in the SIEM makes sense to you. and it helps you understand what's going on in the background. So when a real life event's going to happen, you can probably put two and two together a lot faster, just because you understand what's going on in the background, and where the data is coming from and where you're not getting data, because obviously there was some stuff that we didn't see, and the stuff that you didn't see is what's most interesting, because that means you're missing some data sources. So if you put in a theme and you're only collecting Windows logs, for example, you're going to be limited to Windows logs. So as you add new technology, it's going to become a prerequisite to make sure it integrates into your SIEM solution. So if we deploy another solution for antivirus, we want it integrated. Something that does DLP, it's going to have to be integrated. And all these technologies that we're adding for security are going to be providing logs that can then be correlated, and rules can be put into the SIEM in order to float the valuable things to the top. So essentially, I think that doing the POC in the way we did it, aside from using the traditional grids that you'll Google on the internet for, what's the pros and cons, or what are the features that one product has that another product doesn't, and then sitting down and going through it with your technical team of seeing which one of these has value for you and putting a weight on it. So aside from that component, doing the actual testing and at the same time, I think is really valuable, because it gives you that depth that you would normally take probably a lot longer to get.
Great. Thank you for that further detail. We do actually have some interest going back, Erik, to your definition of cyber, and someone was hoping you could briefly repeat that.
Oh, cyber, yeah, and I'm trying to think of the company that I got it from, but you can contact me afterwards, and I'll give you the actual quote, because I think it's great. And again, it's because most people think that you solve security with nifty tools, a silver bullet. And this is what we've done over the years, that we've created these layers and layers and layers and layers of control, and trying to make sense of it has been very difficult. And so cybersecurity, the root of that is Greek, and it comes from the word Kubernetes. It's like Kubernetes to some degree. And if you look up the root of that in Greek, it means to steer or to govern. And really, technology is about governance as much as it is about whiz-bang technology.
All right. And with that, it looks like we have one last question. Little particular one, but I think you guys can maybe take a stab at it. But it's around understanding how architecture can help with alarms when they're being generated 24/7. Is there a certain policy that you have? Are there systems? Is there automation that helps you keep up with it when it's such a constant threat?
Okay, well, Erik Parent here. I'll take the first stab at it real quick and then pass it over to Erik. Essentially, you got to realize that logging things and having events pop up on the screen, there's two requirements, right? If it's something that's really urgent, you do want to take action on it. But there's also an audit objective, right? If you're doing it for compliance or anything like that. And I know that when I audit companies, and then I come in and I ask them, do you have centralized logging or any form of logging? And if the answer is yes, and then I ask them, well, how many events do you log? And then they'll tell me something like 600,000 events. And I go, so you have a system and you basically parse through 600,000 events. And then they'll answer yes. They'll be very proud of that. And then I'll ask them, well, how do you actually do it? How does a human actually pass judgment on 600 events or 600,000 events? And then they start seeing the direction I'm taking, because that's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. So you have to tune these things so that the valuable items float to the surface. So when it comes to 24/7, it really depends on your business model. So if you really are operational 24/7, then you may have to have somebody who is willing to take a message in the middle of the night. And if you don't, then maybe you can wait till the morning. But the idea is to have the good stuff float to the top, so that essentially your analyst only has one page of things to look at, every day. And if something goes past a certain threshold, then it would be very normal to send off an SMS, send off a more interactive alert that brings it to the attention of someone to take an action immediately.
Perfect. I couldn't have said it better. And you want to avoid alarm fatigue. And so you need to design your policies. So a lot of times people think policy is just this one-time thing. But what you do is you use your SIM to tune it so you can prevent that alarm. And you want to be looking at your most important stuff. If you find out that someone is accessing a lunch menu from 2 years ago, that's not important. So again, from a zero trust perspective, if you're looking at what's toxic, focus on that. So what's toxic, who should have the role to it, where is that data secured? If someone is trying to ping that server and they don't have the rights to go there, that alarm should bubble up right to the top. And the rest of them, not so much. So you can qualify your alerts, and thresholds based on your business, and mileage will vary depending on your business and the industry.
All right. Well, with that, it looks like we are out of questions. We do want to thank everyone for their time, especially our speakers and attendees. We hope that you found this presentation insightful, and we'll follow up with an email that includes the on-demand version. Thanks for attending.